Today, I'm going to cover how and why intel agencies infiltrate social media. Now, social media, we have all these different platforms. We have Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. A lot of these companies are owned by major, let's say, holding companies. So, like, for example, Google owns YouTube. Facebook owns Instagram. They bought out Instagram a long time ago for a steal of a price. So the question we have is, are intel agencies infiltrating social media? The answer is yes. And why are they doing it? And why are these social media companies cooperating with these intel agencies? So Intel, this is part of the federal government. This is part of mainly the executive branch. The executive branch has all the force. So the executive branch will create different federal agencies under its jurisdiction. This is how we get the NSA, the EPA, FBI, CIA, DHS, all that. That is largely unchecked power. Now, we elect people in Congress, we elect people at the top of the executive branch, but we don't directly elect the people who are going to be the CIA director or the director for the NSA. We don't directly elect these folks. And then underneath these people are, remember, even if you're put in those positions of power, the president will come in, he will appoint someone to be the director of the NSA. You're only there temporary until that president leaves. Now, the new president most likely will switch you out for someone else who is politically aligned with them. So really, behind the scenes, there are people who have been there for decades. There are people who are there long-term. They're part of the administrative state. And I don't want to go too much in a tangent on this, but there's a whole separate government when it comes to who's really running the country. And we have to acknowledge that there are certain crises that happen in not just modern history, but history in general, and they will continue to happen in the future. Some are real, some are fabricated. The real ones are leveraged so that power can be extracted from the people and then taken and given to these federal agencies. So now these federal agencies will have a crisis like we did in 2001 with 9/11. Right after that came the Patriot Act. There was enough public sentiment to pass bills, even though these bills were unconstitutional. So what that means is we have the Constitution, that's the supreme law of the land. Every law that we have on the book has to align and match with the Constitution. If it does not match, it is considered unconstitutional. It's unlawful. Yet there are so many laws on the books that are unconstitutional, but they're enforced because there's enough sentiment in these hierarchies, in these different executive branches. And when you have enough of a cultural force in the hierarchy, you can enforce laws that do not align with the Constitution. Unfortunately, a lot of these laws go against our individual rights. So the Patriot Act was initially designed, it was actually initially designed to be deviant, but one of the designs that was told to the public was to go after terrorism. Hey, we have this issue with terrorism. We need to rile up the country, become nationalistic. We're going to go after terrorists. We're going to have a provisioning in this bill so that whoever we allege of terrorism, and generally it's supposed to be foreign terrorism or terrorism that comes to our American soil, they have different rights than what is in the Bill of Rights. And so they don't necessarily have to go to a due process court system, just to lay that out as an example. And so with that was extracted. And so now anyone here at home could be considered as part of that provisioning in that bill of that law, could be considered a terrorist. So you could be a domestic terrorist, for example. So now you're not, even though you're an American citizen, you are not afforded the same rights that is in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution. And so that now creates a troublesome territory because the whole purpose of having Bill of Rights is that when you are falsely or correctly charged with a crime, you still have rights to defend yourself. With this Patriot Act bill, you can no longer defend yourself. Now that we have social media, we have all these platforms that we're conversing on, we're having discourse, we're talking about information. Information is spreading like wildfire because we as humans, we gossip, we spread rumors, we spread true information, we spread false information, we talk. This now poses a threat to people in power, part of the executive branch, but not just the executive branch. Like I said, there are factions that have branched off from the government who are actually running the country, as well as other institutions in tandem with Congress, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. But let's focus on the executive branch because they have all the force. Because they have all the force and they want to control the narrative, they're most likely to control the narrative because they have all the force. They will work with these social media companies and say, we need to suppress XYZ information, or we need to suppress XYZ person. Okay, so they want to target people. And even with there's a new bill about TikTok, banning of TikTok. In this bill is more jargon similar to the Patriot Act, most likely worse than the Patriot Act in many ways, but they're aligned on many ends. with this new bill, they can go after people who are hiding information from the government. So for example, it could be unintentional. Let's say you use a VPN, a virtual private network. This is to change your IP address so that, let's say you're on a public Wi-Fi. If you're on a public Wi-Fi, there are people who can tap into that public Wi-Fi and see what all the different devices are doing. Now, this is a way to, when you change your IP address, to hide who you are and what you're doing from external people who are coming into the system, coming into the virtual network. And if you use a VPN, there is jail time, because now the federal government, it makes it harder for the federal government to come in and see what you're doing. And so there's a lot of, it's unconstitutional, but a lot of tricky regulation that is being purposely passed in this TikTok bill to make it seem like, hey, out of national security, we need to ban TikTok. But really, it's another ploy to remove individual rights from the people and have more power allotted to the federal government. So now the federal government will come in different instances. It's been like this for a couple decades now, but it's getting even worse now. They'll work with companies like Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg has even talked about it publicly. They'll work with other companies like Twitter. This is before Elon Musk took over. This was in the FBI. There were FBI memos and DHS memos, Department of Homeland Security. And they were explicitly saying, we need to suppress XYZ information because we think it would influence the narrative against our ideological goals. So right there, that's whether the federal government is directly or indirectly attacking our rights, that is unconstitutional. We have a First Amendment. We're allowed to spread information, whether true, whether false, whether intentional, whether unintentional. The whole purpose of this is so that we, the people, cannot be exploited by centralized power. Are there reasonable restrictions that we could implement? Yes, but the whole reason why we have absolute rights, where there's no reasonability to restrict any of our rights, is so that nothing can be exploited. There will always be people who want power, influence, wealth, status, and if they find any opportunity where they can exploit the people, take power from the people and give it back to themselves and grow their centralized power, that serves as a problem for we the people. That's how our nation ultimately crumbles. So now the next question is, why are these social media companies working with the federal government? Aside from force, these social media companies, they want to create an oligopoly because this is how they gain market share. This is how they have more control over the population when it comes to sales, consumer rights. They don't necessarily have to compete with other companies who may take over the social media space. And so there's a type of cooperation with social media companies, corporations, and the federal government, the different agencies within the federal government. This is called fascism. When you have corporations working with government, and sure, one side may have more leverage than the other, and this leverage may switch at different periods of time, but this is ultimately fascism. When you have corporations working with governments to remove individual rights. This is unconstitutional as a whole. Definitely the federal government and the agencies and the people at the tops of hierarchies need to be held accountable. Even the people at the bottom of the hierarchies who are still obeying the orders, even though there's nuance there because they're at the bottom and they don't really have much of a choice because they have to work a job, there still needs to be punishment for that. At the same time, but we should go after people at the top of the hierarchy because that's how we actually change the culture and the directive of what's going on. At the same time, we have these corporations, these social media companies. They also need to be held accountable. In many instances, they're politically prosecuting people, selectively prosecuting people by kicking them off their platform, suppressing information, causing interference when it comes to our democratic processes. So they actually are committing crimes when it comes to that, even if it's at the behest of the federal government or the different agencies that are coming to them, the DHS, FBI, NSA, whatever. So now that we know there are interests that align, so both parties benefit. One party has, they both have the same ideological goal because a lot of these social media platforms, they lean on the left and they want to censor people who don't align with their narrative. The people who run these federal agencies, they also align on the left. So they have the same ideological goal. At the same time, they have interests that are profit motive interests, financial interests, growing their company interests, preventing other companies from entering the market share or marketplace interests. So those align. The only thing that we're missing here to break this up are people who hold these institutions, these agencies, these corporations accountable. I say this over and over again because there's no other solution. If there are people in power who have a certain ideology and they have more power, whether it's 60% to 40% or 51% to 49%, they have more power, they're going to be able to get a lot more done to pursue their ideological goals. This is a problem if it goes against the Bill of Rights. This is a problem if it goes against the Constitution. This is a problem if they're passing bills that degrade our freedom and liberty. A lot of people don't notice because it happens very slowly over time. Over the past 5 years, it's happened much more quickly. But generally, it happens very slow, where every 5 to 10 years, we see more and more degradation of our rights. I'll give a very simplistic example. It may seem radical right now, but it was very common in the past, and it aligns with our Constitution. We have seen a lot of unfortunate circumstances at schools. And with these schools, we have mentally deranged people who are often, more times than not, on big pharma medication. And so they lose empathy. They have suicidal ideation. And they come into these schools, and we have children that are affected negatively. We don't want that. Now, the main narrative will be, well, let's go after guns, when we know the solution is to beef up security at those places. No one goes to a military base, no one goes to a police department and tries to create havoc, because they would get shut down immediately, because everyone there is armed. If you go to a school which is federally funded or publicly funded, that means you, the taxpayer, have the ability to use your rights because it's publicly funded. So if you're using your taxpayer money and you're funding the city, the state, or the federal government, and the city, state, or federal government erects buildings, you have the same rights in those buildings as you would on the public sidewalk, which means you have a right to carry. I'm not saying go and do this. I'm just saying what's in the Constitution, what aligns ideologically, and lawfully with the Constitution. You have a right to keep and bear arms. You have the right to protest. You have the right to freedom of speech. I could give a basic example, but let's say there are kids in a classroom, okay, a public school building. People do have a right, technically speaking, as per the Constitution, to go into that classroom and start protesting. Would it be disruptive to the classroom and the learning and the education? 100%. It comes down to culture, because right now the culture is no parents, no other students, no other random people are going to come to the school and start protesting. There are also barriers of force, because there are cops, there are 1 to 2 cops at schools now, and they will come and they will kick you out, even though that's unconstitutional. You do have a right to be in those classrooms and start protesting for whatever reason. I don't agree with it. I don't condone it. I'm not saying go and do it. I'm just stating what's part of the Constitution, what aligns with the Constitution. So if people understood that you actually have your rights and you can use those rights, that becomes culture. When we have degraded our culture to a point where it's not only socially acceptable to accept status quo or normative practices, and then we make it law, even though the law is unconstitutional, everyone's okay with it because everyone has just agreed with it. Everyone has implicitly or explicitly agreed with it. So me just stating, yeah, you have a right to go into a classroom and peacefully protest, that's part of your First Amendment right, in a publicly funded building. A lot of people would say, oh, no, you can't do that. They might say it's illegal. They might say it's bad. They might say, no, we're not going to do that, whatever. But, and again, I'm not saying do that, but I'm giving an example of how that would be, I don't want to say the majority of the population, but a good amount of the population, if you go back 100, 150 years, would understand that's part of the Constitution. You could do that if you wanted to. And maybe some people even did that from time to time to prove a point in whatever cause that they had. But nowadays, maybe only 5% of the population understand that you can do that. I would even argue a lot of conservatives and libertarians may not, I'm not going to say agree with that, but may not understand that that's part of the Constitution. They may not understand that is part of their individual right to be able to do that. And that distinction is very important, because once you know your rights, then you can spread it to culture. And then when people understand that having your rights is such a vital part of this institution that we call the United States of America, we can affect real change. If we don't understand our rights, if we just accept what's part of the establishment, what's the status quo, what everyone else is doing, well, of course, we're going to get situations like the federal government can just come in. Again, it's made out of people. They will come in, they'll work with people who are part of different corporations, and they'll collaborate. And if their interests align, who are the people that are going to suffer the most? The little folks like you and me who are using these platforms to freely speak, to connect with people, to say information. Maybe it's an opinion, maybe it's politicized, maybe it's not. Maybe we're just saying that we're in a recession, but the federal government disagrees because they want to hide the information. So they come in, they say, oh, we're not actually in a recession. And because you said that, that's misinformation. We're going to kick you off. Whatever you're going to say, whether you're political or not, they have a reason, they have a justification to come after you, because almost anything can be politicized. Not many people think about that. A lot of people think that politics is people with suit and ties. Politics is much bigger than that. Politics could be you're at your work office environment and Susie hates Sally and you have to figure out a situation to make sure they don't interact, but you still got to get a meeting together and have certain goals achieved. That's political. Politics is interests, incentives, motives, and figuring out the best strategy to align those interests, or to align certain interests against other interests, and to understand people's motives and incentives and why they do what they do or why they don't do what they do. This is a much more complex game than just government. This is a game that we play in life, with hierarchies, with strategy, with structuring. Once we understand that, we can actually do some positive change in the society. Otherwise, we're going to keep going downhill like we've been seeing. A lot of people don't notice their rights are going away, but after a certain period of time, well, I suppose most people still won't understand, even when it hits them right in the face, because we could go back to World War II, and even people in Germany did not acknowledge or understand what was happening right in front of their eyes. And that's a sad reality. Only a minority of the population will actually see, I've lost my rights over the past 5 to 10 years. It could be something as simple as consumer choice. Your dollar degrading due to inflation because the government keeps printing a ton of money, and they're allowing banks to leverage 10 to 100 times more money than they actually have. So they're fabricating money out of thin air and giving it out as loans or whatever. You losing your purchasing power is also a degradation of your individual rights. And not many people understand that, but once you do understand it, it's enlightening.